Joining us next is the Right Honorable Patricia Hewitt. And Ms. Hewitt has certainly had a lot of roles in her time. She served in Tony Blair's government for nearly 10 years. First as Cabinet Minister for Women, then as Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, and finally as Secretary of State for Health. She was first elected MP for Leicester West in '97 and stepped down from Parliament in 2010. Now, she is the Senior Independent Director of BT Group, the Chair of the UK-India Business Council, a Non-Executive Director of Eurotunnel Group, a member of Barclays Asia Pacific Advisory Committee, and a Chair of Cathis Children's Trust. And just in case that wasn't enough, she's a graduate of Cambridge University and also holds an honorary degree from London Business School and De Montfort University. So please join in welcoming the Right Honourable Patricia Hewitt.
Thank you so much for that lovely welcome and introduction. It's really been a pleasure for me to be here with you. Sadly, not for the whole of this morning. A whole lot of other things happened, like discovering that I hadn't renewed the residence parking permit. At least my children never discovered the trick of putting toothbrushes down the toilet. But we all have these little problems in our lives. So I had a few things I had to sort out this morning. But it was absolutely fascinating for me to listen to that last panel discussion, because 20 years ago, and it was 20 years ago, I've just realized, I wrote a book called About Time, The Revolution in Work and Family Life. And I argued in that this huge increase in the number of women in the workforce, coupled with the IT revolution and globalization, was making it possible to transform the old male model of working time and working lifetimes and create a world in which different people would combine their paid work, their family, everything else in their life in different ways at different stages of their lives. And it was just wonderful to hear all of you on the panel describing all the ways in which what I imagined 20 years ago is actually happening, and much of it in ways that I never dreamt of or predicted. Although one of the things that came out of that book was that when I was Cabinet Minister for Women and Secretary of State for Trade and Industry, I was able to introduce the law that initially gave parents, fathers as well as mothers, of younger children the right to request flexible working hours. It's been hugely successful. There's been almost no employers rejecting those requests. And in fact, it's been extended initially to parents of older children, people caring for elderly relatives. And now I'm very glad to say the coalition government is going to extend it to everybody in the workplace. So a change that came out of my own commitment to different ways of working. Thank you. But you actually very kindly asked me to speak a little bit about health and what I was able to do as Secretary of State for Health, and also reflect a little bit on differences between government and business. So I will do that, or at least offer a few brief thoughts before we come to some comments and questions. When Tony Blair appointed me as Secretary of State for Health in 2005, I was absolutely over the moon. You know, there's nothing more important to each of us and to our families than our health. My grandmother, who was a great inspiration in my life when I was a child, she was the first woman on our local hospital board. And being a wonderful gardener, she used to go off every week with a great armful of flowers. And she would say, not for the patients, they get lots of flowers, but for the nurses, because nobody's really looking after them. And by the time, well, that was in Australia, because I'm Australian by origin, though, as you can hear, I've lived here rather a long time. But in Australia, when I was growing up, all healthcare was private, and you paid for it from your own pocket or from private insurance. So it was quite an eye-opener for me to come to Britain and find the wonders of our National Health Service. But by the time I became Health Secretary, my mother was in her 90s, getting increasingly frail, beginning to have some dementia. And so I was seeing at first hand just this huge challenge for families, but for society as a whole, of an increasingly elderly population and the illnesses that, of course, can go with that. So when Tony asked me to be Health Secretary, I thought, wonderful. I can concentrate on the really big issues that are confronting every health service in virtually every country of the world, which is how do we help people lead healthier lives rather than just treating their illnesses, and how do we meet these challenges of an aging population and more chronic diseases. Well, I had some chance to do that. I was very lucky to be the Secretary of State at the time when we were able to move forward on going smoke-free. So I'm afraid if any of you resent not being able to smoke in bars or clubs these days, you can blame me for that one. It undoubtedly has had a bigger impact on people's health than anything else that we've done for probably the last 20 years. It took up, I have to say, a very small part of the 2 years I spent as Health Secretary because events, as ever, rather overtook me. One of the first things I had to deal with as Health Secretary was a campaign that felt very close to my own heart by a wonderful woman called Barbara Clark, a former NHS nurse herself who had breast cancer. And like so many women of my age, although I've not had breast cancer myself, I have seen so many friends go through it. And she needed, and her doctor had recommended, a very new drug treatment called Herceptin, which is right for certain kinds of breast cancer. The problem was it wasn't actually licensed yet at that point for use in Europe, and it was so expensive. Most parts of the NHS were already saying they couldn't afford it. Now, we'd already instituted a policy, I think very sensibly, where politicians did not try and make clinical decisions and say to the NHS, you must make this drug available. But I did do something different. We'd established an organization called NICE, National Institute for Healthcare Excellence, and Clinical and Healthcare Excellence, which is now a world leader in terms of evaluating treatments for clinical effectiveness, but also cost effectiveness. What I discovered was they were only going to look at Herceptin after it had gone through the lengthy process of being licensed by the European medical authorities. And I persuaded them and found a bit of extra money for them so that they could start their evaluation process at the same time as the clinical licensing was going on. And the upshot of that was that I was able to say to Barbara Clark and all the other women who needed Herceptin that as soon as it was ready for use, the NHS would be ready for them. So that was an important change, but it was also an eye-opener about the fact that even though the NHS by then had more money than it had ever had before and was rapidly heading for above the European average healthcare spend, resources are finite. There's never enough to do everything you want. That came home to me very powerfully a couple of months later when we discovered that the NHS had a financial crisis. They had overspent the budget. Not every bit, it was a minority of hospitals who'd overspent, but the service as a whole had overspent. And worse than that, actually, the people running the NHS at the top didn't know that it had overspent. This came as a huge surprise. So most of the 2 years I was Health Secretary, I spent grappling with that problem and sorting out leadership, financial structures, and a whole host of other things that were not where they needed to be. And it's terribly easy, I found, for me or anyone else to end up sounding terribly managerial and technocratic when you're talking about the NHS and money. And I think that's become a real problem in the current debate that is going on about the government's health reform bill. And what I got very used to was furious NHS staff saying to me, look, we are dealing with life or death. Don't talk to us about money, just give us more. And I found myself saying, it is because you're dealing with life or death that we have to help you to get every possible penny of value out of every pound that the taxpayer is putting into the NHS, because that is the only way that we're actually going to be able to afford Herceptin and all the other wonder drugs coming through, and actually equally, or if not more important, put the nursing and the other care in that an elderly population needs, improve the mental health services for the growing numbers of people with depression or other mental health problems, and so on. And I found myself absolutely passionate about what needed to be done. And what I discovered was in the NHS, we have, and there's all kinds of international studies to establish this, we have the fairest health service in the world. But we don't always have the most effective. And I remember being shocked rigid when the chief executive, a good man whom I'd got to know quite well, the chief executive of an acute hospital trust that was very well rated by the regulators, told me that for a patient, probably elderly, with a fractured hip, very typical accident and injury amongst elderly people, the average length of stay in his hospital until very recently had been 25 days. Now, the best 10% of the NHS in those days was doing that operation and getting the patient home or into rehabilitation in 10 days. World class was 5 or 6 days, and all those figures will have come down since then. His hospital, which was by no means the worst on this measure, 25 days. Now, the upshot of that was those patients were less likely to recover from the operation. They were less likely ever to go home and live independently again, and actually many of them would die. Pneumonia, all the other complications that can happen to you after that kind of accident and operation. Now, he got his hospital down to about 15 days. You know, he was improving, though still not where actually the hospital should have been. But that kind of story was typical and could be repeated, sadly, all over the NHS. So actually, when we talk about making the NHS more effective, more efficient, more productive, it's really important to realize this is actually about giving the best possible care to patients and, frankly, wherever possible, keeping them out of hospital because you're doing the preventive work rather than simply the cure when it's needed. But I now find I can have a rather different perspective on the NHS. I'm, as you just heard, I'm a director of BT. And yesterday, purely by coincidence, I spent the morning at the Customer Service Operations Centre that BT runs for the National Health Service out in Hertfordshire. BT is one of the NHS's major IT partners. Indeed, we are the major IT partner. And the piece I was looking at is essentially the very high-speed broadband network and all the stuff that sits on it that connects the whole of the NHS. All the GP surgeries, the hospitals, the health centres, the nurse practitioners in the community, the whole lot. And the team I was meeting are effectively the IT help desk for the 1.3 million NHS staff who connect into this network. They are technically absolutely brilliant, but what really fired them up and what was so interesting as I got to meet them yesterday morning was, of course, they know, and they know it very directly from the staff who are ringing them, that this is about life or death. And if the IT network and the telephone network goes down, or indeed if something happens to the data, then that absolutely can mean the difference between life or death. So it happens to be part of the NHS IT system that is working really well, with the result that you will never read about it in the press. So when you see headlines about the NHS IT disaster, it is quite important, I think, to remember that actually almost all of the modern IT equipment that has been put into the NHS, including great things like digital imaging, so we no longer have to worry about old-fashioned X-rays, they're all working really well. But you won't ever, as I say, read about them. Very frustrating for those of us who are actually involved in delivering them. But I have another perspective as well, which has to do with India, because of the work that I do there, both promoting trade with India, but also working with an absolutely inspirational women's and children's charity in the slums of Delhi. There is India, rapidly becoming one of the largest and most important economies in the world, with, of course, hundreds of millions of people living in terrible poverty, but with this fast growing middle class and some of the best hospitals in the world, delivering not just clinically wonderful care, but care that is unbelievably efficient. So there's a heart hospital, for instance, in Bangalore, world-class cardiac operations, but at a fraction the cost of an American or British hospital. Not really because salaries are lower, although for some staff, of course, they are. It's because they have completely redesigned the clinical processes, the administrative processes that sit underneath them. They've, of course, put IT in from the outset. They are doing it with a level of efficiency that, frankly, our NHS could only admire and learn from. But one reason why they're doing it, the main reason really why they're doing it, is because these hospitals don't just want to treat the very rich in India, they want to treat the very poor as well. So they have to do things in the most cost-effective as well as clinically effective way they possibly can. Now, of course, these are private hospitals, so talking about efficiency and even profit, those aren't dirty words in the way that they can be in the NHS and some other parts of our public sector and government. And I suppose one of the things that I've learned in government and learned in a very long time in politics, you know, there is good and bad and plenty of mediocre in both the public sector and the private sector. And our politics, when I was young, was bedeviled by a kind of ideological divide, where you had one party saying public good, private bad, the other one private good, public bad. And it was a very sterile debate. We have, I think, moved well beyond that. But the contrast between business and government can be sometimes quite surprising. I recently met up with two old friends who served at the same time in government as I did. All of us are now spending at least part of our time in the private sector. And one of them, the friend of mine who'd most recently joined a major private company in Britain, we asked her how she was getting on. She said, "I am loving it." She said, "You're not going to believe this. One of my really senior colleagues came up to me last week and said, 'How are you getting on? Is there anything more we can do to help you? You know, we really want you to succeed.'" The other two of us who'd been with her in government and in politics for decades fell about. We said, "You mean you don't have colleagues stabbing you in the back? You don't have colleagues who are briefing against you to the media? You don't have colleagues undermining what it is you're trying to do or slagging you off because you're a woman? No, you don't. You've got colleagues who actually want you to be part of a winning team." Now, that may sound cynical, and not all politics is like that, but it very much reminded me of the story that is always told, and I think not apocryphal, about the new Member of Parliament coming into the House of Commons and the old hand saying to him, as it was, "Remember, you sit here, your opponents sit opposite you, but your enemies sit behind you." And that, I have to say, was the aspect of politics that I most disliked. Like some of the women we heard from them in the earlier session, I never planned my career. I feel incredibly fortunate to have had the time I have had as a political activist, as a constituency member of parliament, as a government minister. I loved it, and I hope I did some good. I have to say, I also love being out of it. And I feel incredibly fortunate to have now a new phase in my life, which is partly about business, partly about charity and not-for-profit work, partly about having much more time with my family, my friends, and even my garden. But it is wonderful to be able to shape your life in those ways. And I think in this world of ours that is so completely different from the world in which I was a student and a young graduate, and with all the smarts that you bring to this world, I just want to wish you the very best of luck for everything that all of you will go on to do, both personally and in your professional lives. Thank you.
We have time for
take some questions. Thanks.
We have time for a few questions. Hello, I won't say what firm I work at because of the question I'm going to ask. One of the things that never ceases to amaze me is that female MPs are branded as shrill and bonkers, and they're even sometimes told to calm down. I was actually in a meeting where a woman did raise her voice, and she was actually told, calm down, you know, don't lose your rag about it. What can women coming up do to kind of break through those type of stereotypes that are perpetrated?
And you've put your finger on something really important, and particularly if you're in public life, it's compounded by our utterly appalling media, or most of it anyway. And the abuse, frankly, that women politicians especially get from most of our newspapers, utterly sexist, quite a lot of it from women journalists as well as men. It's very, it's just a nightmare to deal with, and it compounds the sexism that is all too prevalent within politics anyway. Now, I think it comes back to a lot of what we were actually hearing from the last panel about developing your own style, being clear that you don't need to behave like the boys in order to be confident and assertive, put your own point of view across, be sure of your own values and all the rest of it. But I think if you do get that particular response of, oh, for God's sake, don't get so upset, don't be so hysterical, I think you're entitled, and it's what I do, I think you can say, I do feel very strongly about this. I think we should all feel very strongly about this. It goes to the heart of what we're about as a business, or something of that kind. And I also think, although this is a more risky strategy, but especially as you get a bit older, I do think there are occasions when, as men get emotional or angry about something, you could just do a little bit of, oh, please, don't get hysterical. But as I say, higher risk strategies. So you have to be a little more careful about when you use that one. But pointing out the language and the sexism that's going on with it, just finding subtle ways of doing that, maybe not so subtle ways of doing it, I think that's helpful.
The Blair government did some wonderful things for women with regards to extending maternity leave and maternity leave, and we've heard earlier about the flexible working. It's also very much a double-edged sword. Mm-hmm. And if you look at how, for example, women in the US stay in the workforce much longer, in part because they get a nanosecond of maternity leave, I'm interested in your perspective about what maybe some of the unforeseen consequences have been for women in terms of managing their careers due to the policies.
It's a very real problem. And I brought in that whole package of improved maternity pay and leave, 2 weeks paid paternity leave, which was massively controversial at the time. we had all these men and all these employers saying, why do you need that? What will they do? Extraordinary, as well as the right to request law I was mentioning. And I was reflecting on this recently. Now, I think we made a mistake. I think we should have found a way, instead of going to 12 months maternity leave for women, most of it paid, we kind of kept extending the payment period. Actually, we should have said, the first 3 months, 6 months, whatever, for the woman. After that, either. And indeed, what we should also have done was the Scandinavian model, 3 months for the man only. Use it or lose it. Because actually what they found in Scandinavia is the only way really to encourage and enable men to take a significant amount of time off, not just the initial paternity leave, is actually to say, this is your bit, and if you don't use it, then the family loses it. But this was such new thinking at the time. I tried some of this because I'd been writing about this when I was in a think tank before I became a member of Parliament. But it was so new, there was no voice supporting it in the wider world. We didn't have a good fathers movement at that point. We had the ones who climb up Big Ben and do that stuff. Not terribly helpful. The women's movement and the trade unions who'd been campaigning for maternity leave actually weren't particularly in favour of doing anything for fathers, and we had a manifesto commitment. And I guess also I was very committed, I was very passionate about my right to request law, but I had to put an inordinate amount of time into actually building support for that, making that for fathers as well as mothers. And for all these different reasons, it was just, in a way, too soon. And so we went down the track of more and more paid leave for mothers, and we didn't do what I think the coalition government will now find a way to do, which is actually open up the same choices for men, because it should be about choice, whether you go back earlier or whether between you take the full entitlement and so on, very much as colleagues were talking about on that last panel.
We'll take one more question.
Hello, my name is Monica Hernans. I'm director of Lenfro, and I'm an alumnus of the Executive MBA. I just wanted to pick up on something that you said, that the greatest abuse sometimes that you receive from journalists had been from female journalists. Mm-hmm. In my 20-year working career, I have seen that men are able to support men mm-hmm. in ways that I just don't always see women supporting other women. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts? What do you think we women can do to help other women?
Well, what a critically important question. And it's disappointing, I think, that you've had that experience, because although you're right that most men, as they move up the ladder, will mentor and they will build a team of supporters, they will encourage them, promote them, help them in their careers, and so on and so forth. And more men are doing that for women as well as for men now. My experience has been that on the whole, and there are notable exceptions, but on the whole, women, as they move up their careers, also want to mentor and encourage younger women. There are exceptions to that, the kind of Queen Bee syndrome. Sadly, Britain's first and so far only woman Prime Minister never had another woman in the cabinet. And that was not for lack of female talent in Parliament at the time. But I think the critical thing is doing, as I think you've been hearing from all the women this morning, actually supporting younger women in their careers, doing it in your own workplace, mentoring women, this kind of event, sharing experience and lessons learned. It is really important, I think, for the younger generation of women that you actually should be able to look to more senior women in and outside your own organisation for that kind of support. And frankly, all of us who are committed to the success of our own businesses and the success of our country as a whole, we all know if we're not using to the full both halves of the human talent pool, then we're not going to do as well as we possibly could. So, there is an argument from self-interest about doing this, as well as just doing it because it's the right thing to do, and above all, it's massively enjoyable. So.
I think that's all the time we have, but I just want to say thank you to Patricia once again.